He thought he could turn her into a joke in front of a room full of cameras, but had no idea he was about to hand her the stage and lose everything that made him untouchable. The grand hall of the Sterling Arts Theatre shimmered under warm golden lights, crystal chandeliers casting reflections across polished marble floors as guests in tailored suits and evening gowns settled into velvet seats, their quiet conversations blending into a low, elegant hum that carried the weight of expectation. And at the center of it all stood Adrian Cole, a world-famous pianist whose name alone could sell out 1,000 seats in under an hour, his reputation built not just on talent, but on precision, discipline, and a confidence that bordered on absolute authority, the kind of man who didn't just perform music but commanded it, shaped it, owned it, and tonight was no different, except for one small interruption that barely registered in his mind at first, a woman moving quietly along the edge of the stage, adjusting a microphone stand, her steps careful, almost invisible, her presence blending into the background the way it always had, because Evelyn Carter had spent the last 3 years in places exactly like this, unseen, unheard, part of the machinery that made brilliance look effortless, her simple gray cardigan and worn black flats a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding her, her hair tied back in a loose knot, her posture modest, her movements efficient, the kind of person people looked through rather than at, and Adrian noticed her only when a slight delay in the rehearsal broke his rhythm, a pause just long enough to irritate him, his fingers hovering above the keys as he exhaled sharply, glancing toward the side of the stage where Evelyn stood, adjusting cables with quiet focus. And in that moment, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of amusement, subtle but deliberate, the kind that came from a man who had spent too long being admired without question. He leaned back slightly on the piano bench, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearby crew and a few early arriving guests. "You," he said, gesturing casually toward her, his tone light, but edged with something sharper. "You seem familiar with the setup. Ever tried playing one of these?" A few heads turned, curiosity sparking instantly, the room sensing the beginning of something unscripted. Evelyn paused, her hand resting lightly on the microphone stand, her eyes lifting just enough to meet his for a brief second before dropping again, a quiet, almost automatic gesture. "No, sir," she replied softly, her voice steady but understated, and that should have been the end of it, a passing exchange, a minor interruption, but Adrian smiled, slow and deliberate, as if an idea had just presented itself fully formed. "Well," he continued, his tone now carrying a playful challenge that echoed just a bit too loudly in the elegant hall. "Maybe tonight's the night." A few scattered chuckles followed, subtle at first, then growing as more people picked up on the shift in tone, the suggestion hanging in the air like an invitation no one expected her to accept. And somewhere in the back, a phone lifted, then another, the quiet click of recording beginning to spread, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone, and certainly not by the man who believed he was still in complete control of the moment, because to Adrian, this was harmless, a brief distraction, a way to entertain the room, to remind everyone of the gap between mastery and mediocrity. But what he didn't see, what no one in that room could possibly understand yet, was that the woman standing quietly at the edge of his stage had spent years mastering silence, and silence, when it finally breaks, doesn't ask for permission. The laughter did not explode all at once but spread in careful ripples, like a quiet agreement forming across the room. A few amused smiles turning into soft chuckles as guests leaned slightly toward one another, whispering behind polished hands, their attention now fixed on the unexpected exchange unfolding on stage, and Adrian Cole, sensing the shift, allowed it to linger, his fingers resting idly on the piano keys, as if he were orchestrating not just music, but the moment itself, his confidence steady, practiced, unshaken, because in his world, moments like this always ended the same way, with him in control and everyone else reminded of their place. And Evelyn Carter remained still at the edge of the stage, the microphone stand now forgotten, her hands lightly clasped in front of her, her posture composed but unassuming, as if she were considering whether to step forward or simply fade back into the quiet space she had always occupied. And for a brief second, it seemed like she would choose the latter, her gaze lowering, her shoulders subtly shifting as though preparing to retreat, But the room did not let her disappear, because attention, once given, does not easily release its subject, and Adrian's voice came again, softer this time, but carrying unmistakable intent. "Come on," he said with a faint smile. "Just a few notes. It will be good for everyone." And there it was, the gentle pressure wrapped in charm. The kind that made refusal feel like overreaction. The kind that made compliance feel harmless. And a few more phones lifted, small glowing screens capturing every second. The quiet hum of recording now woven into the atmosphere. And somewhere near the front row, a young man adjusted his live stream angle, whispering commentary under his breath, his audience growing by the second as the situation unfolded. Because moments like this, unscripted and slightly uncomfortable, had a way of pulling people in, and Evelyn finally looked up again, her eyes steady now, not defiant, not eager, just present, and she took a slow breath, the kind that settles something deep inside rather than on the surface, her fingers relaxing at her sides as she stepped forward, one measured step onto the stage, then another, her shoes making the faintest sound against the polished floor, a contrast to the silence that had begun to settle around her. The earlier laughter fading into something more curious, more attentive, as if the room itself was unsure what it was about to witness, and Adrian shifted slightly on the bench, turning just enough to watch her approach, his expression still composed, but now carrying a hint of anticipation, because in his mind, this was the moment where expectation would be confirmed, where the gap between professional mastery and amateur uncertainty would reveal itself clearly, cleanly. And he gestured lightly toward the piano, offering her the space with a polite flourish that felt more performative than generous. And Evelyn paused beside the instrument, her gaze falling to the keys, her reflection faintly visible in the glossy black surface. And for a heartbeat, everything held still, the chandeliers above casting a soft glow, the audience leaning forward almost imperceptibly, the cameras steady, waiting, and then, without a word, she reached out and placed her hand gently on the edge of the piano, not yet playing, not yet committing, just claiming a space she had never been invited to before, and in that quiet, suspended second, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because the room was no longer laughing, and Adrian, though he did not show it, felt it too, that almost invisible change in the air, the kind that precedes a moment no one can take back. There was a difference between touching a piano and knowing it, and as Evelyn's fingers hovered just above the keys, that difference became something almost visible in the air, a quiet tension that drew every eye in the room closer, without a single word being spoken, and Adrian watched carefully now, his earlier amusement still present but thinner, more measured, because something in her stillness did not match the uncertainty he had expected. She was not fidgeting, not glancing around for reassurance, not smiling nervously to soften the moment. Instead, she stood with a calm that felt deliberate, as if the noise around her had already faded into the background long before she ever stepped onto the stage, and one of the guests near the front leaned forward, whispering, "Is she actually going to play?" while another adjusted their phone, zooming in, capturing the angle of her hands, the subtle rise and fall of her breathing, and somewhere in the livestream comments, reactions began to stack rapidly, short bursts of text predicting embarrassment, anticipating failure, waiting for the moment when the illusion would break and confirm what everyone already believed, that this was a mistake, a harmless one, but a mistake nonetheless. And Adrian shifted slightly, his hand resting casually on the edge of the piano as he spoke again, his tone lighter, almost encouraging now. "Anything simple will do," he said, the words chosen carefully, framed as kindness but carrying a quiet boundary, a reminder of what he expected from her. And Evelyn nodded once, a small acknowledgement, not submissive, not resistant, simply accepting that the moment had already begun and there was no need to fill it with unnecessary words. And then, without announcement, without build-up, her fingers lowered onto the keys, not striking them immediately but settling into place with a familiarity that did not belong to hesitation. It belonged to memory. And for a fraction of a second, nothing happened, the room holding its breath in that suspended silence, until the first note came, soft, controlled, precise, not loud enough to command attention but clear enough that it could not be ignored, and it hung in the air longer than expected, followed by a second, then a third, each one placed with intention rather than speed, and something shifted instantly, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded reaction, but in a way that removed the laughter completely, because this was not random, this was not uncertain, this was structured, deliberate, and as the sequence continued, the notes began to connect, forming a pattern that felt familiar to some and unfamiliar to others, but undeniably complex. And Adrian's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his shoulders tightening just slightly as he listened. Really listened now. The casual detachment gone, replaced by a focus he had not intended to give, and the audience followed. Their earlier expectations dissolving into quiet attention, phones still raised but no longer shaking with amusement, now held steady, recording something they did not yet understand, and Evelyn's hands moved with increasing confidence, not rushing, not performing for effect, but building something carefully, as if she were not trying to impress the room, but simply continuing a conversation she had started long ago. And in that moment, the space between who she appeared to be and what she was actually doing began to stretch wider with every note. And no one in that hall, not even Adrian, could pretend anymore that this was going to end the way they had expected. By the time the melody unfolded into its next movement, it was no longer subtle. It was undeniable, the structure revealing itself with increasing clarity as Evelyn's fingers moved across the keys with a precision that did not belong to someone guessing or experimenting. It belonged to someone who understood exactly where each note needed to land before it was ever played, and the shift in the room became absolute. Conversations had stopped entirely. The soft rustling of programs and fabric had disappeared, and even the quiet hum of the air system seemed to fade beneath the growing presence of the music, and Adrian felt it more than anyone. The realization forming not as a single moment, but as a series of small corrections in his mind. Each phrase she played forcing him to reevaluate what he was hearing, because this was not just competence. This was interpretation, phrasing that carried intention, timing that reflected control rather than imitation. And then it happened. The passage, a sequence so technically demanding that even seasoned performers approached it with caution, a section Adrian himself had once struggled to execute flawlessly in a live performance. And as Evelyn's hands approached it, a quiet tension returned to the room. Not the kind that expected failure, but the kind that anticipated something important, something revealing, and she did not hesitate. Not even for a fraction of a second. Her fingers accelerated with controlled energy, each note landing cleanly, evenly, with a confidence that erased any remaining doubt, and the effect was immediate. A visible reaction passing through the audience like a wave, eyes widening, heads lifting, phones tilting slightly as if to capture the moment more clearly, and somewhere near the front, a woman lowered her device entirely, choosing to watch instead of record, because the performance had crossed a line from curiosity into something that demanded presence. And Adrian's expression changed completely now, the faint smile gone, replaced by a stillness that bordered on disbelief, his gaze fixed on her hands, tracking each movement as if searching for a flaw that did not appear, and he leaned forward slightly, almost unconsciously, drawn into the performance he had never intended to witness, and the live stream, still running in the background, began to surge, comments flooding in faster than they could be read, viewers reacting in real time to the unfolding reversal, the narrative shifting from expectation to astonishment within seconds, and Evelyn continued without acknowledgement of any of it, her focus absolute, her posture steady, her movements efficient and unforced, as if the room, the audience, the cameras, and even Adrian himself had ceased to exist, and there was only the music, unfolding exactly as it was meant to. And when she reached the final sequence, she did not rush it. She allowed it to breathe, each note placed with deliberate care, drawing the moment out just long enough that the silence between the notes carried as much weight as the sound itself. And then, with a final, controlled motion, she lifted her hands from the keys, and the last note lingered in the air, suspended for a heartbeat longer than expected, before fading into complete stillness, and no one moved, no one spoke. The room held in a silence so complete it felt almost tangible, The kind of silence that does not come from absence but from realization, and Adrian Cole, for the first time in years, had nothing to say. For a moment that stretched longer than anyone expected, the silence refused to break, not because the audience did not know how to respond, but because they were still catching up to what they had just witnessed. And then, somewhere in the middle rows, a single pair of hands came together, one deliberate clap that echoed sharply against the marble and glass, followed by another, and then another, until the entire room rose into a wave of applause that filled every corner of the hall, no longer polite, no longer restrained, but genuine, unfiltered, and overwhelming. And Evelyn remained seated at the piano for a brief second longer, her hands resting lightly in her lap, as if she had simply completed a routine task rather than something that had just shifted the atmosphere of an entire room. And when she finally stood, she did not bow immediately. She simply stepped back from the instrument, giving it the same quiet respect she had shown when she approached it, her expression calm, composed, unchanged, as though the reaction around her did not define what she had just done. And Adrian did not move right away, his gaze still fixed on the keys, his mind replaying the performance with a precision he could not turn off, analyzing phrasing, timing, dynamics, searching for inconsistency, for imperfection, for any explanation that would restore the balance he had assumed was fixed, but none came. And when he finally looked up at her, the authority that had once filled his posture had shifted into something quieter, something uncertain, and the audience noticed it, the subtle change in the man who had commanded the stage just minutes earlier, and the live stream continued to surge, viewers multiplying rapidly as clips were shared in real time, titles forming instantly, captions predicting what the world was about to see, because moments like this did not stay contained, they traveled, and they carried with them the raw clarity of what had just happened. And Adrian stood slowly, his movements no longer performative, no longer calculated for effect, and he stepped toward Evelyn, stopping just a few feet away, close enough that the cameras could capture every detail of his expression. And for the first time since the evening began, he did not speak immediately, the pause itself becoming part of the moment. And when he did finally find his voice, it was lower, measured, stripped of the casual superiority that had defined his earlier tone. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a setup, but as a genuine question, one that carried the weight of everything he had just witnessed. And Evelyn met his gaze steadily, her answer simple, unadorned. "I never stopped," she said, and the words settled into the room with the same quiet certainty as her final note, offering no explanation beyond what was necessary. And Adrian held that response for a second, absorbing it, understanding more from what was not said than what was, and around them. The applause continued, but it had changed. It was no longer directed at a performance alone, it was directed at a realization, at the unraveling of an assumption that had existed in that room before she ever touched the keys. And as the cameras continued to record, capturing every angle, every reaction, every expression, one thing became clear to everyone watching, both in the hall and far beyond it. This was no longer just a moment of music, it was a moment of truth, and it had already begun to spread. The applause did not fade quickly, it lingered, echoing through the grand hall as if the walls themselves were holding on to the moment, unwilling to let it pass. And even as some guests slowly lowered their hands, the energy remained, a quiet electricity running beneath every movement, every glance, every whispered exchange. And Evelyn stood there for a second longer, not soaking in the attention, not resisting it either, simply allowing it to exist without claiming it, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded in the same quiet composure she had carried before a single note was played. And that contrast only deepened the effect she had already created, because while the room had shifted entirely, she had not, and that alone unsettled expectations even further. And Adrian felt it more than anyone, the imbalance, the reversal, the unfamiliar position of standing beside someone he had underestimated and now could not fully measure. And he glanced briefly toward the audience, then back at Evelyn, as if recalibrating his role in a moment he no longer controlled. And somewhere near the back, the livestream numbers surged again, notifications flashing as clips were shared across platforms, captions forming instantly, phrases like unexpected performance, And you will not believe this, spreading faster than the original moment itself, and the camera lenses remained fixed, capturing not just what had happened, but what was happening now, the aftermath, the subtle consequences unfolding in real time. And Adrian took a slow breath, stepping slightly to the side as if to give her space that should have been offered from the beginning. His voice quieter now, not projecting, not performing, but acknowledging. "You should not be behind the stage," he said, and the words carried more weight than any introduction he could have given. And Evelyn met his gaze again, steady, calm, her response just as simple. "I was not trying to be seen," she replied, and that answer settled into the air with a different kind of impact. Not dramatic, not forceful, but undeniable, because it revealed something the room had not considered, that what they had just witnessed was not an attempt to impress, not a moment she had been waiting for, but something that existed independently of recognition. And that realization shifted the audience once more, their applause now replaced by something quieter, more reflective, as if they were reprocessing the entire sequence from a new perspective. And Adrian nodded slightly, absorbing her words, understanding now that what had just happened was not a performance in the traditional sense. It was a revelation, one that did not belong to him, and certainly not to the narrative he had tried to create. And for the first time, he stepped back completely, allowing her to stand at the center of the stage without interruption, without framing, without control. And in that space, with the lights still warm and the cameras still recording, Evelyn Carter stood not as someone who had proven a point, but as someone who had simply revealed what had always been there. And the world, watching through countless screens beyond that hall, had already begun to understand it. The moment did not end when the applause softened. It evolved, stretching beyond the walls of the Sterling Arts Theater and into a space no one in that room could fully control anymore. Because while the audience inside the hall slowly settled back into their seats, the audience outside had only just begun to arrive. And within minutes, the clips that had been casually recorded were no longer just personal keepsakes. They were circulating, shared, reposted, dissected, each version carrying a slightly different angle, but the same undeniable truth. And back on stage, the staff who had once moved quietly in the background now stood still, watching with a kind of disbelief that came from recognizing someone they thought they understood and realizing they never had. And Evelyn felt those looks, not as pressure, not as validation, but as a shift in how the space around her responded. And she remained grounded in the same stillness, her hands now resting loosely at her sides, her attention not on the crowd, not on the cameras, but on the quiet aftermath of something that had already passed. And Adrian turned slightly, glancing toward the wings of the stage where the production manager stood frozen, unsure whether to continue the rehearsal or acknowledge that the evening had already taken a direction no schedule could contain. And for the first time, Adrian did not give instructions. He did not reset the moment. He did not reclaim control. He simply observed, and that absence of authority was noticed, felt, and understood by everyone present. And a few rows back, a guest whispered, "That was not part of the program." And the person beside them responded quietly, "No, that was something else." And those words captured what the room was beginning to realize, that this was no longer about performance. It was about perspective. And the live stream numbers climbed higher, comments flooding in with reactions that ranged from disbelief to admiration, viewers asking who she was, where she came from, how someone like her had remained unseen for so long. And the questions themselves carried their own answer, because the assumption had never been about her absence. It had been about their attention. And Evelyn turned slightly, looking toward the side of the stage, where she had started, the place where she had existed without being noticed. And there was no hesitation in her movement as she took a step in that direction, as if returning to that space was the most natural thing she could do. And Adrian noticed immediately, his voice cutting gently through the quiet, not commanding, not stopping her, but acknowledging her movement. "You do not have to go back there," he said. And this time, there was no performance in his tone, no hidden meaning, just a simple statement shaped by understanding that had come too late to prevent the moment, but just in time to recognize it. And Evelyn paused briefly, turning her head just enough to meet his eyes again, and there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, only clarity. "That is where I work," she replied. And the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than anything else that had been said that night, because it reminded everyone that nothing about her had changed, only what they had chosen to see. And as she stepped away from the piano, moving back toward the quiet edge of the stage, the cameras followed, the audience watched, and Adrian remained still, no longer the center of the moment, but a witness to it, understanding now that respect is not created by position, and it cannot be granted by authority. It is revealed in the exact moment someone least expects it. By the time Evelyn reached the edge of the stage, the atmosphere behind her felt entirely different from the one she had left just minutes earlier, not because the space itself had changed, but because every person within it was now seeing it through a different lens, and the quiet corner she had once occupied no longer felt invisible. It felt watched, acknowledged, understood in a way that could not be undone. And the stage crew who had once moved past her without a second glance now stepped aside instinctively, giving her space not out of routine but out of recognition, and she resumed her place near the equipment with the same calm precision she had always carried, adjusting a cable, aligning a stand, movement steady, unhurried, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, and yet everything had, and Adrian remained at the piano, not seated, not performing, simply standing beside it. His reflection faint in the polished surface as he looked out at the audience, many of whom were no longer focused on him, their attention drifting toward the woman who had just redefined the entire room without asking for it. And that shift lingered, subtle but undeniable, and somewhere in the front rows, a guest leaned toward another and whispered, "She just walked away." And the response came quietly, "She never came here to stay." And that realization settled deeper than the applause ever could, because it reframed the entire moment, not as a rise to the spotlight, but as a glimpse into something that existed long before the spotlight was ever turned on, and the live stream continued to surge, now flooded with messages identifying the piece she had played, analyzing her technique, comparing her execution to recordings by renowned performers. And in each comparison, the same conclusion surfaced again and again, not as exaggeration, but as observation, that what they had just witnessed was not imitation. It was mastery, and Adrian exhaled slowly, the weight of that understanding settling into him, not as defeat, but as clarity, and he turned once more toward Evelyn, who was now almost exactly where she had been at the beginning of the evening, a quiet figure at the edge of a grand space. Except now there was nothing ordinary about how that position was perceived, and he took a step in her direction, not to reclaim the moment, not to redirect it, but to acknowledge it fully, his voice reaching her again, softer, deliberate. "You changed the entire room," he said, and this time, there was no audience in his tone, no performance layered beneath the words, only a recognition that could not be reversed, and Evelyn paused briefly, her hand resting on the side of a console, her gaze steady but distant, as if she were measuring the statement against something internal rather than external, and when she responded, it was with the same quiet certainty that had defined every part of her presence. "The room was already what it was," she said. "People just noticed it differently." And that answer carried through the space with a clarity that silenced even the remaining whispers, because it shifted responsibility away from her and placed it exactly where it belonged, on the perception of those who had chosen not to see, and Adrian nodded slowly, understanding now that what had unfolded was not a transformation created in that moment, but a revelation that had simply been allowed to exist. And as the lights continued to glow and the cameras continued to capture every second, the narrative that had begun as a casual test had fully dissolved, replaced by something far more enduring, the realization that true brilliance does not arrive when it is invited, it reveals itself when it is no longer ignored. By the time the evening resumed its scheduled rhythm, nothing about it felt the same, not to the audience, not to the staff, and certainly not to Adrian Cole, who returned slowly to the piano bench with a composure that looked familiar on the surface, but carried a weight it had not held before, and as he placed his hands on the keys once more, the room settled into a different kind of silence. Not the anticipatory hush that had greeted him at the beginning of the night, but a reflective quiet, shaped by everything that had already unfolded. And when he began to play, the notes were still precise, still technically flawless, but they were received differently now, filtered through a new awareness that had shifted the audience's perception in ways that could not be reversed, because brilliance once revealed in an unexpected place, changes how all other brilliance is measured. And while Adrian performed, the story beyond the hall continued to grow, spreading across screens and conversations, clips accumulating views by the thousands, then the hundreds of thousands, each replay carrying the same turning point, the same moment when expectation gave way to something real, and Evelyn remained where she had chosen to be, just beyond the edge of the spotlight, continuing her work with the same quiet focus that had defined her long before anyone had thought to notice, her hands steady, her presence unchanged, as if the recognition surrounding her was simply another sound in the environment, neither sought nor resisted. And yet, the way people moved around her had shifted permanently, glances lingering a second longer, voices softer, space given without being asked, not out of obligation but out of understanding. And when the performance finally came to its formal close, the applause rose again, but it carried a different tone, one that acknowledged not just what had been performed on stage, but what had been revealed beside it, and Adrian stood, offering a bow. That was as controlled as ever, but when he straightened, his gaze moved briefly, deliberately, toward the side of the stage where Evelyn stood, and he held it there for a second, not as a gesture meant to be seen, but as one that needed no audience to carry meaning. And she met that glance with the same calm steadiness she had shown all night. No more, no less, and then returned her attention to the quiet tasks that had always been hers. And as the guests began to leave, conversations filled with a different kind of energy, not centered on celebrity or expectation, but on something simpler and far more lasting. The realization that what people choose to overlook often says more than what they choose to admire. And outside, under the soft glow of the theater lights, phones continued to light up with notifications, the moment already becoming something larger than the room that had first witnessed it. And inside, the stage slowly returned to its original state, cables coiled, stands adjusted, lights dimmed, and Evelyn Carter moved through it all with the same quiet presence, no longer invisible, but never seeking to be anything else. And somewhere in the distance, long after the last note had faded and the last guest had gone, the truth of that night remained, steady and unmistakable, that dignity does not arrive with recognition, and talent does not depend on permission, and the world, for a brief moment, had remembered what both of those things look like.